Hello world, it's Siraj and the Abstraction and Reasoning Challenge. This is the most exciting Kaggle challenge I have ever seen, and it is by Francois Chollet, the creator of the popular deep learning library Keras. There are $20,000 worth of prizes that are going to go to the top teams, and this is the most interesting, challenging, yet publicly accessible challenge I've ever seen. So there's a dichotomy there. It's at the same time the most difficult challenge, but also the challenge that the most amount of people can join in, because it goes against the compute is all you need narrative that deep learning and machine learning are currently in right now, where if you just give your algorithm more and more compute, it's going to be able to solve everything. That's kind of like the mentality right now. And Francois is like, no, we're going in the wrong direction with that. We need to be able to learn from small data, not huge data sets. That is how we get to artificial general intelligence, the type of intelligence that can solve any task. Whatever you give it, it's going to be able to solve. And he wrote this incredible paper on it called On the Measure of Intelligence. And so it's kind of a package that he released. He released the paper, he released a related data set for it, and then he released the competition. Brilliant move by Francois. And honestly, I wish we had more of this. Like we need more open source competitions to incentivize the community outside of, say, Facebook or other companies that are dedicated to gluing people's eyes to their ads, to create AI systems that are more powerful, more general purpose, so we can apply them to things that matter, like healthcare and finance and supply chain and all the other fields. Okay, so what this video is it is your introduction into this challenge. What I've done is I've read all of the amazing kernels that the community has submitted. We're going to go through some of them, and then we're going to go through a technique called neural program synthesis that I have been reading about myself. It's a very interesting subfield of AI that has really opened my eyes to what is possible here, and I hope to impart some of that to you in this video. So we have a lot to go through in this video. If it's your first time looking at a Kaggle competition, don't worry. I'm going to show you how to submit your own prediction as well to Kaggle. Okay, so this is for beginners. This is not for advanced people. This is for beginners, but we're going to go through as much as possible. All right, so let's get started here. When you go to Kaggle, you have to sign up, create an account, and once you sign up, there's going to be a little blue button on this page that you're going to see, and it's going to say Join Competition. Since I've already joined, now it says Submit Prediction, but if you're new, it's going to say Join Competition. You click on that button, and it's going to show a list of rules. You accept the rules, and you've joined. Now you can submit predictions. So I've actually submitted my own prediction, and lo and behold, what is it? Let's see where I'm at. Number 280, first place. Thank you very much. It sounds very not impressive. I know. But guess what? Look at who I'm tied with. I'm tied with literally everybody except for the top 17 people. So everybody has the same score, 1. But the idea is that the lower the score, the better. Okay, so that just goes to show you how difficult or how interesting and how unique this challenge really is. So there are 4 steps here. Join the competition, kind of already did that. 2, analyze the data. 3, apply machine learning to that data. And then 4, submit our predictions to get an accuracy score. So we're gonna go through that pipeline together. We've got math, we've got a lot going on, all right? So first of all, let's take a look at this paper. I mean, this is a relatively long paper. It's about 60 pages. I mean, just take a look at the table of contents here. Basically, Francois goes through the history of AI and all of the semantics around it. Although this field is relatively new, compared to the other sciences, it's only like 50, 60 years old, there's still been a lot of debate around terminology and what constitutes AI, right? Even today, the top researchers are debating, what the word AI even means. And Francois goes through the context, the history, and one thing I really like about Francois' viewpoint is that he is both an optimist and a pessimist in the best way. Because if you're too optimistic, then you're going to miss the mark. You're not going to make the appropriate predictions about what the next algorithms are going to be. If you're too pessimistic, you're not going to invent anything. But there's a midway point, an equilibrium, and I think Francois is there. So, in reading this paper, I learned a lot about the history of AI, but probably the most interesting part, and I encourage you to read the paper, is the data set that he released with it. So let's take a look at this data set right here. It's called the Abstraction and Reasoning Corpus. And what we can do is we can download it ourselves and we can just go right into it. It's got this nice little interface that, you know how they say a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, let's see the picture right now. So we're going to cd into it, and then we're going to open it up. So what do we got here? Testing interface.html, boom. Let's take a random task. It's going to pull it from the web. So it's going to pull it from that GitHub repository. And now we have our interface right here. So here's what it is. There are 400 training tasks, and then there are about 600 evaluation tasks. Each task contains several of these tile configurations with the colors and the squares, right? And then there's one output. So the idea is to create an algorithm that can learn the relationship between input and output, right? So supervised learning, and you're like, oh, supervised learning, just throw a convolutional network at that, right? But remember what I said, there are 400 training examples, not thousands, which is what deep convolutional networks need. So, to go back to what Francois said about this, you will not find tutorials online on how to do this. This challenge is something new. You are expected to think on your own and come up with novel, creative ideas. It's what's fun about it. Exactly. So deep learning is not going to work. Deep learning is not going to work for this. There's too little data. What we want to do is we want to create an algorithm that will learn the relationship between those input and output pairs using only 400 data points, which is quite a challenge, actually. It is quite a challenge. It's never been done before. It's something that's more data efficient in terms of how it's able to learn than what OpenAI was able to do with OpenAI 5 for the Dota games, or what DeepMind was able to do with AlphaGo Zero. It's a more data efficient algorithm that's necessary to solve this. So you're basically competing against all the top researchers in the world, but at least you're incentivized to do this. And even if you don't solve AI, at least you'll have learned a lot, right? And you can even get that score up, by whatever means necessary, as long as it's within the Kaggle rules. So, the crux of the paper is, what is intelligence? Is it a set of subroutines that are in our head, like sit down, browse the web, brush your teeth, walk, run? Are these all functions, or are we learning them all from scratch? Is there some kind of randomly initialized neural network that we have that's just learning through, say, differentiation over time? Is that what it is? Is the human brain just a deep reinforcement learning problem where the world is our Markov decision process, we are the agent, and our brains are just matrices of values? Is that how it works? And so Francois says no in this paper. He's like, no, that's not it, because deep learning is incredible. We love deep learning, obviously, but as it can be used to solve individual tasks like AlphaGo or Dota, but it's a very constrained environment. And as you can see here in this AlphaGo Zero cheat sheet I pulled from Google Images, this is a very complex algorithm, and there's a lot of tweaks and tricks that they use, Monte Carlo tree search, deep neural nets, ResNets, to get this to work on this one problem. But that we are measuring the wrong thing. Francois says that we are measuring the wrong thing. We are confusing the process of intelligence with the artifact that's produced by it. And what that means is we're confusing the pickle file, whenever you train your network via TensorFlow or PyTorch or what have you, you're confusing the result of that, the collection of matrices that you called your pre-trained model, with the actual concept of intelligence, which is actually a process. And so he says, and he argues, that let's start measuring skill acquisition efficiency, aka few shot or one shot learning. So the idea is that instead of having big data sets, you have a small data set, right? And so this is not a new idea. This is something that we have wanted to do as a field. All of the researchers out there have wanted to do. All of the promoters of the researchers have wanted the researchers to do for a few years now, but it just hasn't happened yet. But there has been some very promising research in that direction that I'm going to talk about in this video. Deep learning, it's not going to be able to work, but we humans, we could actually solve this. Just by looking at this, we can see there's a square, there's a little X, there's a square, there's these patterns, and then we can kind of try and figure it out by selecting these and coloring them in and saying, okay, this is probably what the output is, and then we could submit, we could see what our wrong solution here. So this is kind of like a human IQ test. Like, humans can compete, AIs can compete in this, and if we make an AI that's able to do this better than a human can, Okay, AGI incoming. You know, it's like seriously, it's super cool. Okay, so that's the first part. Okay, joining the competition, learning about what it is. Now let's get to the funner part. Step 2, analyze the data. There are so many amazing kernels that the community has submitted here, and we're gonna go through a lot of them in a second. But the one that I wanna start off with is this Abstraction and Reasoning Starter Notebook by Inversion. I love this notebook right here. We're gonna start off with it. So let's edit my copy of this. So let's go through this notebook and see, what's happening here. So, okay, we import NumPy for linear algebra. We got pandas for data preprocessing. Let's load up that data set using a Kaggle kernel. So Kaggle kernels, I don't ever use them. I use Google Colab, but in the case of competing in a Kaggle competition, much easier to just use a Kaggle kernel. And I'll tell you why. Because the data set's already loaded into memory. You don't have to deal with data importing into Google Drive, which is a pain. And also it's very easy to submit. It's like a one-click submission process that I'm going to show you just in a few seconds, a few minutes. So as you can see, we are seeing all of that data right here. And so each task is a JSON file, as you can see here. We're going to import some more libraries for visualizing the data. And we can see we've got an evaluation folder, a test folder, and a training folder. And we're going to create directories for all of those, and then let's print out some of those training tasks right here. Okay, and then this part right here was not in the notebook. I found this from Tarun Sriranga, this ARC competition EDA and PyTorch CNN notebook. He had this great little EDA snippet that I'm going to paste into here so we can view the data that we've loaded right here using Plotly. And basically this is our way of seeing what the numbers are in those training matrices, because each of those training data points, those squares are actually matrices of numbers, right? And each of those numbers are associated with position and color. And as you can see, most of the numbers in that training set, they're mostly zeros. So I guess you could say it's a sparse data set. And then you've got ones all the way up through 9. So we don't have any double-digit numbers. That's good to know. We are restricted to a small set of scalar values that our algorithm will be able to learn and predict. And once we do that, we can keep going. So we know that part. We did a little bit of EDA. We've got some training data. We got some testing data. And let's plot one of the tasks using one of these functions. Guys, the people in the Kaggle community have done so much already. It's incredible, the amount of collaboration that's happening. So cool. And so if we look at this task right here, we can see our input pair and our output pair. There are two. We've got a training input, training output, testing input, testing output. And intuitively, we can look at this and we can say, okay, I see the difference here. For that input, just add yellow squares inside of the pockets, inside of any available pocket in the first structure. And the same for the next one. Inside of any available pocket, inside of a structure, a green structure, add a yellow square. So intuitively, we already can find the rule with our eyes. How did we do that? We're using our visual apparatus for this. We're using our convolutional filters that we know for a fact are in our brain. We're creating representations, and then we're using some kind of logical sequence to synthesize a series of steps, program synthesis for what this is. Kind of. I'm getting excited, so I'm going a little further into this tutorial. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. We're about to go into program synthesis in a second. And so once we have that, let's go ahead and just create a submission file. We'll have to flatten all of those outputs so that they look like this. So they're just one single line. And Invariant wrote out this function which will very beautifully turn this into a CSV file. And when we're done, we can click commit. And what's going to happen is it's going to save that as a version. This is just like, it's using Git under the hood to commit some version of your repository. And once it's committed, we can then open that version and submit it. And we'll go all the way down to output. And as you can see here in output, we have our submission. We didn't apply any algorithms to it, but we do have a very basic a pair of all of those predicted outputs for the testing sets. We can click Submit to Competition. When we click Submit to Competition, it's going to say, okay, we're calculating your public score. It's going to be 1 because I didn't modify anything here. This is just an existing notebook. I didn't write any of this. This is just to show you how to submit something to Kaggle. And then we'll say use it for final score, and that's it. And then we're on the leaderboard. Okay, so that's how you submit to Kaggle. That's us analyzing the data. That's us submitting to Kaggle. And then once we've done that, we can keep going. So now that we've submitted something initially to Kaggle, let's see if we can apply some machine learning to this data, okay? So already there's some incredible, like I said, incredible notebooks that the community has already written out here. And I found 3 that I found particularly helpful. So let's start off with this PyTorch CNN one. So what Tarun did here is he used a convolutional network to learn the relationship between input and output pairs. He's treating each of those matrices as images, which they are. And then he is finding the relationship using those convolutional filters. Now we know that convolutional networks are amazing at doing that, but given a lot of data. In fact, Francois himself said, let's not use deep learning. Deep learning is not going to work here. Yet he still did it. And he's got some great EDA here looking at the distribution of values, all good stuff. That's what you're supposed to do, relating the widths to the height of each of these. And he's like, okay, I'm going to learn the relationship between inputs and outputs using a deep convolutional network. I will build it in PyTorch. Good job for using PyTorch. Here's what it's going to look like. It's got 2 convolutional blocks: input convolution ReLU, max pool. Here's the model right here: train, test, go through, oh my God, it's taking forever. Lost, train, I'll save you like an hour here. And submission. And people were kind of surprised. They were like, okay, this kind of works. I'm kind of surprised at how good it was. But even Tarun later says, it turns out it may not be able to generalize properly to new test data. I mean, we know that because Francois said so. In fact, let me read you what Francois said about deep learning. He said, if you don't know how to get started, I would suggest the following template. Take a bunch of tasks from the training or evaluation set, 10, okay, we can do that. For each task, write by hand a simple program that solves it. It doesn't matter what programming language you use, pick what you're comfortable with. Okay, Python. And now look at your programs and ponder the following. Could they be expressed more naturally in a different medium? What would a search process that outputs such programs look like? How could we simplify this search? And once we've generated a set of possible candidates, how do we pick the one most likely to generalize? You will not find tutorials online that do any of this. Okay, so let's do that. Let's create manually create functions for 10 tasks that we pick that will be able to convert those inputs into those outputs. And luckily for us, someone already did this. Okay, so it's manual coding for the first 10 tasks by Nagis. Okay, so if we look at Nagis's file right here, and we can see what those tasks were. So we've got task train 000. And so he said, okay, upsample it, tile it. He's performing these operations using, I think it's NumPy. It is NumPy, yep, it's NumPy. So he's performing these operations with NumPy, and he's finding the shape, he's adding padding, get closed area. So as you can see, these are very specific functions for very specific tasks. If you applied any of these functions to any other task, it's not going to work, right? And that's the beauty of machine learning, is that deep neural networks don't need to learn rules. You don't need to give them rules. They will learn the rules for you. But the problem with deep neural networks is that we can't interpret what that program is. We can't look inside that black box and see why it's making those decisions. And so he did this very beautifully. And so looking at these tasks, we get some kind of idea, these functions, of what needs to be done. We know that, what are the bare bones things that we know? We know that we need basic math operations, like there's going to be some need for add, subtract, multiply, divide, to move elements, to change colors, to slide elements, to maybe crop an image, basic functions like that. That is what we know we need from looking at this. But, what next? What do we do here? So on that note, what next? This is one of the most beautiful, this might be the most beautiful notebook or kernel in the list of community kernels. How to solve this task with cellular automata. So cellular automata is a super cool concept that basically talks about the idea of growing some entity using very simple rules. And what happens is, from like a single-celled organism, complex life emerges. From you and I, like we were, a zygote, we were an embryo, we were a sperm cell, and now we have all of this complexity. How did that happen? From a few simple rules, like a single cell only has a very small, literally, snippet of DNA, of genetic code that has all of those instructions to create a human. How is it so efficiently being done? How is biology leveraging the physics, the laws of physics and of thermodynamics, and which is basically the laws of physics, to create and compute such complexity in such an efficient amount of time? How is this happening? And cellular automata is our way of modeling that in silico. This is such a beautiful blog post by the Distill team that goes into creating cellular automata, where you have a few simple rules, and then from those rules, complexity emerges. And the great thing about them is they used differentiation, so they used a neural network to improve the cellular automata over time, which I've never seen done before. But back to this notebook, what Arseny did is he created a cellular automata, and these were the 5 rules right here. Right here, these were the 5 rules. Take the value, so it's basically a transition rule where you take one of the squares in that cell, and then you just continuously apply these rules to all of the neighboring cells, and then eventually it's going to grow into some kind of crazy thing. And so we can see an example of that right up here. So as you can see, these are just simple rules, but then eventually all these complex organisms emerge. There's an actual Tetris game that's built inside of a cellular automata, like literally initial rules, and then it bubbles up, and then an entire Tetris game is possible. People have created Turing complete computers inside of Conway's Game of Life, another cellular automata. So this is a very interesting idea. And so what he did is he said, okay, let's use cellular automata on some of the inputs to come up with the output. Let's see if we can do that. And he very successfully did that by just using simple matrix math operations on those colors. Take this input on the left, that's halfway there. Let's improve it a little bit. Okay, right? So that's what he did. So the cellular automata was very naive. There wasn't any feedback, there wasn't any learning involved, but it did show that it's possible to grow a solution from using transition rules from an initial input. So that was really his contribution to kind of suggest this idea. Another thing I found very, very interesting is if we look at this rule right here, if we look at his transition rules, these look very similar to the convolutional operations, right? The filters in convolutional networks are like flashlights that slide across the image and look at the most important parts. And looking at the neighboring cells and judging them, this is very much like convolutional networks. So I think we're onto something here. Convolutional networks, cellular automata, basic simple rules, and then building from there. Okay, so let's keep going to what I thought was the most useful notebook out of all of them. So this notebook by Jeremy is super, I think this is probably the best direction that we should be heading in. And by that I mean a domain-specific language. So a domain-specific language can mean a lot of things, but the most general sense of the word, as per my understanding, is that it is a language that is specific to the task at hand. So that can mean very low-level code that is barely human-readable assembly, or even lower than that. Or it could even mean Python functions. So if you have a specific set of functions for this task, that could be a domain-specific language. So that's what he starts off with. He's like, okay, let me build a few functions that I think are going to be useful. Like move up by 2, or maybe another function is called move to the side, or rotate, or flip, or mirror, something like that. And then create an algorithm, in this case it's a genetic algorithm, to find the best sequence of those steps in order to get to the goal output. And let's create some kind of an optimization strategy that says, let's score each of these possible programs and see which one's the best one. And then through the process of evolution, let's create generations of them until we have the most viable programs that have the best fitness scores. Let's go into that. So he starts off with these domain-specific functions, like group by color, crop to content, so cropping functions, split, negative, so turn the black into white, white to black. So these are very basic color and positional functions, transformations. So, okay, that's great for a domain-specific language. And then, so a program in this sense is basically a sequence of these functions. So function 1, function 2, function 3, function 4. Maybe another program could be, for this specific task, it's going to be function 4, function 3, function 3, function 3, function 1, right? So those are all the possible sequences of functions. And how do we evaluate how good a function is? So that's where genetic programming comes in. So the idea behind genetic programming is we're going to say for a given output of a program, and a program is going to be a set of functions, let's measure how fit that program is. So, let's say we have a test input, it's going to be a task, and we're going to apply a bunch of transformations to it, and then we have an output. And then we compare this output to the actual output, right? So similar to how a loss function is computed in deep learning. And then we say, okay, for this output, let's compare it to the actual output. Let's compare its width, so width fitness, let's give that a score. Let's compare its height, so height fitness, it's got to be the similar heights, all the boxes. Activated pixels, the colors, how similar are they, and then concatenate all those scores into a single fitness score. And so that single fitness score is what we're going to rate all of the generated programs, which are generated randomly. So when we build some initial candidate programs, and programs in this case are collections of functions, we can evaluate how fit each of those are. And when we do that, so in this case it was, we're going to get, it's going to apply all of those collection. It's going to generate a bunch of candidates. It's going to try them all out on a given task. It's going to keep iterating until it finds a program that has the highest fitness. So how does it do that? So for all of those candidates, it's going to weed out the candidates that don't give good answers. It's going to keep the best ones. It's going to mutate the best ones by just a little bit to ensure, like add one op to its right but limit the length, add one op to its left. From all of those best candidates, it's going to mutate those best ones, and then it's going to reuse them again and again. So that's asexual reproduction in this case. Sexual reproduction, he didn't get that far, would be to merge both of them together, either through some kind of matrix operation or what have you. There's a lot of ways to do that. But through successive generations, the idea is that eventually we'll come up with a possible solution. And so, it works sometimes. His genetic algorithm optimization scheme, it works sometimes. And I honestly, I think this is the best notebook out there. I think this is the direction we're going to go in. But I also want to say this. Genetic algorithms, I have such a love-hate relationship with genetic algorithms because they're super cool. They're aligned with evolutionary theory, but they just never work. I mean, you never see them being used in production. But, to play devil's advocate towards myself, that's because they don't give good results. And that's because the people who are using them in production aren't focused on AGI. They're just focused on one specific task, so of course not. But let me say this. I think the direction, based on Francois' paper, that he wants us to go is in the direction of neural program synthesis. And so that's what we're going to explain now. Okay, so let's talk about what program synthesis really is. Program synthesis is when we have an input, let's call it X, and we take X and we give it to a program, let's call it P. And this program is going to output the predicted value of Y. So we have some XY pair up here, right? So this is our data point. Let's say it's a dog image and then the label dog, right? So dog image and then the label dog. Worst handwriting ever, that's okay. And so we say, okay, here's our input. And here is our predicted output. But it's not just going to give us the predicted y, it's also going to give us y as a function of this program right here. So this is the predicted program right here. So basically, we know what's inside of this program. So this is called program synthesis. And so an example of that would be this. Let me give you an example of that. Program synthesis would be, say, for example, a decision tree. A decision tree is program synthesis, where we can say, we have X and X equals John Smith. Okay, so that's a name. And we're going to give John Smith to a decision tree. And the decision tree is going to say, is it a man? Is it a woman? And he's a man, so okay. Is he over 65 or under 65? Let's say he's over. And so we'll do that. Okay, just like that. And so what happens is it goes through two decisions. It's a man and he's over 65. So Y, the output is going to be senior male in this case. And so the program is if X dot is masculine, so if it's a man, okay, and if X is over 65, return Y. And Y is this, senior male. So this is a program, right? This is program synthesis. We know the rules that are learned by this, whatever this decision tree is optimized with, some heuristic, gradient descent, whatever it is, we know that this is a program. So that's program synthesis. Then there's program induction. Program induction. Can you guess what that looks like? Guess for a bit while I write this out. Program induction is when we say, here's our input X, let's say it's the dog just like before. We give it to a program P, except one major difference here. We don't know what this program looks like. We don't know what decisions it's making. We don't know what its rules are. Sound familiar? Neural networks. And so we say, okay, this is our program P, and it's going to output Y hat, the prediction of Y. But we don't know what that is. So what would be an example of that? I hope you said neural nets. So an example would be neural nets, where we have our neural network, we give it a dog image, and it applies all these matrix operations to those images, input times weight, add a bias, activate, and then we have our output dog. And so if we look at this network, okay, this program is actually just a collection of ones and zeros. It's just weight values as a pickle file or whatever it is. And we don't know what's happening inside of this. What is this? And so that's where the field of explainable machine learning comes in, but it's not enough. We don't want explainable deep neural networks. We want entire programs that are synthesized just like decision trees, but with small data sets and that are as accurate as neural networks. So we want the accuracy of deep neural networks and the data efficiency of decision trees. How do we get there? Let me show you. So let's talk about what we know our program synthesis model will need for this particular Kaggle challenge, okay? Let's start with what we know. Okay, so the one thing we know for sure is that we're going to need a model that takes in a variable length input. Now, what types of models are not good at variable length inputs? Feed-forward neural networks, that's right, I hope you said that. They are terrible at that. They've got to be a fixed size input. But code is not fixed size, it's variable length. Functions have different lengths. And so we want variable length input. Variable length input, that is a fact. That is something we know that we're going to need, okay? So that's one. What's the second thing that we think we might want, we will need? And let's also talk about what a variable length model looks like. Do we know of any variable length neural networks, for example? Well, one of them would be a recurrent network where we have our, during the training phase, the hidden state, whatever's learned, is sent back to the input at every time step. So at every time step, you have the hidden state and you have X concatenated and they're fed back in. And this is the recurrence. And what this does is it allows the network to learn variable length inputs and outputs. So we have 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. These are sequences, right? So we're going to have sequences. These functions are actually sequences of characters, of numbers, of operations. So we know that we want that. What else do we want to know? Well, we know that we want to have detailed representations. So what do I mean by that? We want detailed representations. Okay, so how do we do that? So we know that, okay, so recurrent networks, those are great for variable length inputs, but these recurrence modules that are inside of recurrent networks, let's call them R. And then we have convolutional modules in convolutional networks, just to have a comparison. Both of them are, they store all of the states across time in a single state vector. And we don't want that. We want to be able to very precisely, very fine-grainedly be able to look and analyze different states, different hidden states across time for our network. We want granular control. So how do we do that? Well, we say no recurrence, no convolutions. We don't want you. What do we want? All you really need is attention. All you really need is attention. Attention is a trick invented by Google that lets us do that. It looks at the specific parts of the input that are necessary that we want to have. And so that's what attention is all about. We want to leverage this attention mechanism, and that's going to give us not just one giant representation, but many little representations that we can mutate and look at and modify and mix up and do all sorts of things with later on. So we know that we want that. So detail representations, aka attention. We want an attention mechanism. And the third thing that we know that we want, this might not be a no, this might be a nice to have, but I think it's a no, and that is function hierarchy. Right? So like I said before, function hierarchy. So function hierarchy is basically saying we don't just want those built-in functions that we have. We want to be able to create new functions, and very crucially, we want to have recursive functions. Remember, these are the hallmarks of computer science: polymorphism, inheritance, abstraction. We want to be able to create a machine, not a human, that's able to understand these concepts and create literally a Python program using those concepts effectively to solve those input-output pairs. So we know we want that function hierarchy, detailed representations, variable length, input. How do we get there? So one of the ideas that came out of DeepMind a few years ago was this idea of the neural Turing machine, which was later evolved to be called the differentiable neural computer. I don't know if you were around back then, but let me give you a little refresher. Basically, the idea is that we use neural networks as basically engines for both memory and for processing. So we have memory and we have processing. So they both store values in terms of the weights that they hold, so that's memory, and then they perform processing by this idea of nested functions. It's just a composite function, f of g of q of however many nested functions we have per hidden layer, and that's the processing part. But the human brain probably doesn't do that. It probably separates modules from memory and for processing. That was at least the idea behind the differentiable neural computer. The idea is to have a controller, and that controller is, let's say, a recurrent network. And so we have a recurrent network that's a controller, and we have a separate memory bank right here. So we split up the memory and processing functions of the network, and so it reads and writes to this memory bank. And by separating these two out, they were able to create a more efficient model. But they never really went anywhere with that. But I think this is a good starting point to think about what we need, because this is the differentiable neural computer, is a great starting point because it doesn't have attention, but it does have the other three requirements that we wanted: variable length inputs, detailed representations, and function hierarchy embedded in there. But I think of all of these related neural program synthesis models, pointer networks are the easiest ones to get started with. So let's look at pointer networks now. If you're interested in learning more about neural program synthesis, this paper by Neil Kant at Berkeley, the best overview of what's happened so far. There's hardly any math in this paper. It's mostly just a review of everything that's been done in order in terms of neural program synthesis research. And eventually you get to this model that's called neural program lattices, which is like the state of the art in neural program synthesis. But it's actually debatable which is better, neural program lattices versus the neural program interpreter right here, which basically it creates these recursive functions, which is what we want. We want to be able to mutate our functions. So let's talk about that. So, on to step 4. We have this kind of base model. We submitted our predictions. We've looked at our data. We've looked at basic ML approaches to the data. We've seen that, nothing's really like sticking out in terms of a much better accuracy score. But we have some direction to go in. I think having a specific domain language as a starting point, that's a good starting point. And then from there, we want to add in a neural synthesis model, like say a pointer network. Pointer networks, very basic. They leverage attention. They have a sequence-to-sequence architecture, and they've been used for neural program synthesis. So we can just start with that. As you can see, Kion has this nice pointer LSTM right here. We can just kind of copy that. Thanks, Kion. Pointer network. Good stuff in Keras. That's what I like to see. And we'll just kind of paste it in here for now and see, what we're going to do. So we're going to say, right before we submit our Kaggle code and we process our data, import this pointer network. And great, it works, it compiles. And so now we have some questions here. So our next steps are this, how big should that prior domain-specific language be? How many functions do we want to give it? And how do we structure those functions so that it's not just, the program doesn't just learn the optimal order of functions that a program will have. It also mutates those functions themselves So let's say one of those functions will have a parameter, and that parameter will then change an internal variable inside of that function that will a mutable variable that will then be different for all future iterations of that function. So every time that function is called in the future, it's going to have a different output because it was mutated. How do we create functions that are mutable? So that's going to require us to go into each of those functions and mutate them. And then I think the most important question here is, how do we generate entirely new functions based on the previous ones? So that I think comes from recursion, right? So how do we create a stack trace of functions, and functions that know that they are nested inside of bigger functions, or functions that are combinations of existing functions? As programmers, we do this when we just now copy and paste different source code snippets with attribution together to create a larger program, or create our own using existing knowledge of different frameworks. How do we put those pieces of the puzzle together? And I think if we do that, then we get to a point where we basically have automated the process of code. We've automated the process of refactoring, of code analysis, of coding itself. And that's when we get artificial general intelligence. I've said so much in this video. I've got links to everything I've talked about for you in the video description. And if you're new here, hit the subscribe button, because I will keep pushing videos every single week. And until next time, happy learning.